This is Plant-Based Briefing. MAHA's natural foods obsession doesn't account for the way we actually eat. Part 1 by Jessica Scott-Reid at sentientmedia.org. And I'm Marian Erickson. This is the curated content plant-based podcast where I narrate a variety of articles on plant-based and vegan living with permission in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. But this article's longer than that, so it's a two-parter. I'm reading part 1 today, and then tune in tomorrow for the second half. So now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. MAHA's natural foods obsession doesn't account for the way we actually eat. Part 1 by Jessica Scott-Reid at sentientmedia.org. The rise of the carnivore diet and the search for simplicity. Trends focused on living and eating more naturally are becoming increasingly popular, off the grid, online, and in politics. This shift, embraced in some right-leaning circles, rejects industrial agriculture's influence on food systems in favor of so-called crunchy ideals. From homesteading to organic farming, raw milk to backyard eggs, the trend toward traditional living may seek simplicity and nostalgia, but it often overlooks the complexities of scaling food systems and promotes misleading ideas about what's natural. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about naturalness, says Professor Alan Levinovitz, author of the book Natural: How Faith in Nature's Goodness Leads to Harmful Fads, Unjust Laws, and Flawed Science, is that it's synonymous with goodness. Levinovitz tells Sentient that this misconception is being exploited by some political movements in a time when people are feeling disempowered and unsure about the increasingly complex world around them. Natural in the age of MAHA and MAGA. With the recent rise of the Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA movement, and the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services, the shift toward natural living and eating has been further fortified in the form of political promises to, in effect, make food natural again. On the agenda, according to Kennedy, is to reverse 80 years of farm policy and instead focus on small-scale, organic, and regenerative farming. But this is extremely unrealistic at scale, thanks to the amount of animal products Americans are currently eating. More on that in a minute. Another component for Kennedy of what constitutes natural is taking on things like red food dye, seed oils, and ultra-processed foods, while promoting tallow, raw milk, and grass-fed beef. The appeal of returning to more old-fashioned foods fits perfectly in line with the regressive desire to make America great again. While eating too much of many ultra-processed foods is indeed a problem for public health, the idea that America will be better off with fewer plant-based patties and more red meat is a hypermasculine and environmentally unfriendly fantasy. After all, a third of all greenhouse gas emissions come from food, and most of those food-related emissions come from beef. But to many, the fantasy that we could all have backyard farms, or at least that all our food could come from small farms, is a comforting one. We live in what some philosophers and historians of technology refer to as an increasingly epistemically opaque environment. And what they mean by that is we don't understand, or we feel like we don't understand, much of the stuff around us, Levinovitz says. This includes our food system. We used to feel like we understood where our food was coming from or how it was manufactured, he says. And so as things become more complicated and people feel more disempowered, I think a turn towards naturalness represents an escape from that epistemic opacity. It feels simpler, he says, to promote the concept of naturalness, as vague as it can be. It feels more intuitive, and it feels like you're in control. The rise of the carnivore diet. Another part of this cultural shift towards more seemingly natural foods, beyond the perceived rejection of large-scale agriculture, is an incongruent rise in more meat-centric diets. This comes after plant-based eating experienced a notable boom during the early 2020s amid mounting evidence of the impacts of animal farming on the climate. It's resulted in a sort of counter-movement, evidenced in trends like the carnivore and other meat-heavy diets. The carnivore diet emphasizes eating only animal-based foods, while some meat-fluencers say it means eating like our ancestors. This stems from false assumptions that our ancestors primarily consumed animal products and that human physiology is optimized for a meat-based diet, when our ancestors really followed an omnivore diet. The carnivore diet has also become increasingly politicized as a fad of the right, encompassing aspects of hypermasculinity and white nationalism. The plant meat backlash. Before there was MAHA and the carnivore diet, there was veganism and the plant-based diet. During the late 2010s into the early 2020s, the U.S. saw an influx of interest in plant-based eating and in the production of plant-based meat alternatives. But novel meat alternatives have increasingly been deemed ultra-processed, fake, and synthetic. juxtaposed against factory-farmed meat that's touted as natural and single ingredient. One source of this backlash to plant-based meat can be traced back to meat industry manipulation. A Super Bowl commercial and a New York Times ad paid for by a public relations firm used by the meat industry planted seeds of doubt in 2020 about scary ingredients in plant-based meat. Sales of Beyond and Impossible Meat plateaued for a number of reasons that food industry media went on to hash out, and debates over unnatural and ultra-processed plant-based products raged. At the same time, the assumed naturalness of animal products persisted, as it does into today, largely unchallenged. Despite the unnaturalness of factory farms, says Levinovitz, a steak looks like it came from an animal, which means that people feel like they understand where it came from. Alternatively, he says things like textured proteins and other processed alternatives simply aren't so transparent in the sense of where it came from and what it is. Nonetheless, he adds, the problem is that people think that just because something is a natural part of our diet, such as meat, it ought to be a part of our diet, or is therefore a healthy or optimal part of our diet. That's the confusion of natural with good. You just listened to MAHA's Natural Foods Obsession Doesn't Account for the Way We Actually Eat, Part 1 by Jessica Scott-Reid at sentientmedia.org, and I'm Marian Erickson, your host. Tune in tomorrow for the second half of this article, where you'll hear why there's nothing natural about modern meat, and why RFK's promises to make the meat industry natural again are unrealistic. So please share this episode with anyone who might benefit, and thanks for listening.